The Big Light presents.
Before we begin, a content warning. In this episode, Kim discusses experience that some listeners may find challenging, including childhood bullying, financial hardship, drug use, and references to mental health struggles and sexual abuse. Please take care when listening. My name is Helena Rafai, and this is the A Sonic Hug podcast. Over the coming episodes, you're going to hear the voices of people from different walks of life who deal, experience, and battle mental health issues. In this episode, I begin a two-part conversation with Kim, whose journey through mental health challenges is deeply interwoven with that of her sibling. Part 1 explores Kim's early life, growing up feeling different, navigating neurodivergence before diagnosis, and searching for identity and belonging. Her story touches on childhood isolation, financial struggles, and how these experiences shaped her sense of self-worth. A note for listeners: throughout this conversation, Kim refers to her sibling who later in life came out as a trans man named Nathan. You'll notice Kim shifts between pronouns when speaking about different periods of their lives together, reflecting their journey of understanding. This intertwined story reminds us how our lives and well-being are often bound together with those we love. This is the first part of Kim's story.
I have struggled with my mental health for, I think, almost as long as I can remember. I remember being a kid, about 8, maybe even younger. I used to get these really terrible stomach pains, which it took years for me to figure out that was actually anxiety related. And so now I live with a condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which has had lots of impacts on my mental health. But I also was diagnosed with ADHD, which made a lot of sense. But the reason that I even went down the road of trying to understand my neurodivergence was because about 4 years ago, I lost my brother to suicide after having supported him for a very long time. So between my own sort of health issues and his care needs and support, and then sort of later realising that I also was neurodivergent. And then I guess the most sort of acute kind of moment for me was about 2 years after my brother passed away. During the pandemic, I was hospitalised and sectioned because I had multiple infections, which led to me having a psychotic break. And I ended up completely sort of disassociated from reality. And it meant that I had to take about 6 months off work. So it was a combination of grief, years and years of managing the various conditions that I have, living in pain, and then sort of culminating with my brother's death a few years back. And then sort of between that and the pandemic, I just got to the point where I did actually push myself too far. It took a long time for me to realise that you can do that. And I've pushed myself quite a lot over the years, but it was the moment where, I think everything about how I manage my mental health changed after that, because I realised that actually it's not infinite. While I was growing up, I definitely felt that I was quite different from others. There was a few reasons for that. One was we were quite poor, and so we never really had any of the things that made you fashionable. And also, I think looking back, that my mum probably is also neurodivergent, and sometimes I think that meant that we just didn't quite read the social cues the way that perhaps others did. So I remember things like I went to one particular primary school and then I changed about halfway through because we moved to a different area. And so I was the new kid, and I also had, my own sort of way of perceiving the world and interacting with people. But I also would quite frequently wear quite strange things, partly because we were buying our clothes secondhand or getting hand-me-downs or whatever, but also because my mum and I were just really attracted to like colour and pattern. And in Glasgow in the 90s and the 80s, anything, I think, that set you apart from your peers attracted a lot of attention, but not necessarily the right kind of attention. So I would say that I had a really, really difficult time at school until I was about maybe fifth year. Yeah, just never really kind of connected with people or felt that the connections that I did have were reciprocal. You know, I felt tolerated, I guess, rather than wanted. I did also get bullied by a couple of teachers, one in the first primary school that I went to and another in the second primary school that I went to. And it was just one of those kind of classic situations where there's a teacher who has their favourites, but then they sort of counteract that by having the kid that they pick on. So I remember even stuff like, you know, when I went to the new school for a whole year, every time I was asked to hand out our school books, mine would be missing. And my teacher would use this as an excuse to send me out of the class, and I would just stand in the corridor crying for ages. I think I actually only put the pieces together about this a few years ago, but I realised that at age 9, it was unlikely that it was a kid in my class. I think it was actually the teacher that was doing it because she didn't like me. I was smart but talkative. I probably seemed like I was trying to tell her what the right answers were or correcting things that she was saying, or the sort of classic ADHD autism child that's sort of too eager and, you know, maybe isn't reading the room particularly well. And so the combination of, you know, teachers sort of being unkind and other kids seeing that meant that I just ended up this sort of, you know, the target for everybody for a couple of years. You know, between sort of primary 4 and primary 6. You know, as I got older, I started to wonder if I'd maybe amplified it in my head or, you know, that it wasn't actually as bad as I thought. But a few years ago, a girl that was in my primary 6 class contacted me on Facebook and said, I should have stood up for you more. You were treated terribly. So it was kind of vindicating that I knew that actually I wasn't imagining it. This wasn't just my perspective alone, like others noticed this as well. And because, you know, my parents were managing our money and trying to make sure that we could sort of keep improving our lives in some way, my mum was at university at the time, so there just wasn't a huge amount of time or energy to really help me, I think. And it just felt like I was really kind of not able to do much other than just get through each day. So I remember just, you know, a few times being just kind of doubled over. It happened at school, and I remember it also happened outside of school where I had to go home because I couldn't stand. Like my stomach was just, it was like spasms, you know, and just so painful. So that was probably the first sign. But I was also like very emotional and sensitive and, you know, all of those things, and, you know, had lots of clubs that I was part of because it was easier to do that than to sort of socialise with kids that I went to school with. When I got to my teens, we obviously moved up to secondary school. So I was at a much bigger school. I'd always been somebody that escaped into books. So I read lots. I actually remember when I went to secondary school, I almost never had someone to have lunch with. I would just walk around the school really fast, like I had somewhere to go. And I would find some quiet place in the school that I could eat my lunch and then just go to class later on. I guess in a way you can be more anonymous in a big school. Like the school I went to had 3,000 pupils in it. So in an academic sense, it was quite good for me because I was only ever really in classes with people who were had a similar interest in the education side of it. And I was always one of those people who had my hand up in class and, you know, kind of did well quite naturally without really having to try. You know, I got called a swot, and I was just easy to pick on. I think I was just very sensitive and you could get a reaction from me quite easily. But over the course of school, I think I was spat on. I was beaten up actually 6 times in the neighbourhood that I grew up in. The first time really badly by a girl in my year. And there was quite a lot of kind of like violence and fighting and stuff in the area that I lived in. I actually think also some of it was to do with the way that I speak. My mum's half English or has a slight English accent from living in England quite a lot of her life. So I never really sounded like the people that I grew up around. You know, I didn't sound like I was from Pollokshaws or Govan Hill or Ardennes or any of those places. So I was just marked out as different very, very quickly. And then, you know, the more I learn about neurodivergence and how that affects your social interactions, the more I realised that that was also at play as well. I was unable to really connect with my peers or even have any sort of insight into how I might be irritating them. Not that I should have to change my behaviour, but, you know, my sister went to school. So the thing that I didn't mention earlier is that my brother was trans. So we were actually sisters when we were growing up. We shared a room and we were very close until he was a teenager. We had a complex relationship where I wanted to be his friend. I wanted to hang out with him. But he didn't really want that from me. And so we would have this kind of weird interaction where we would see each other in the corridor and she at the time would, you know, wander off in a different direction. And the reason I talk about my brother is because my mental health is so interconnected with him and his life as well. I was so desperate for friends when I was at school. And you know, it started to happen eventually. I remember as I got older, kind of having this moment where I was like, I'm trying so hard to be liked and it's having the opposite effect. And this is probably something I've realised again and again and again throughout my life. But at this particular point, maybe going into like 5th or 6th year, I'm sort of 15, 16. And I thought, why am I bending over backwards to be liked by people who have no interest in me? And at that point, I could see the end of school. And I remember sort of just kind of deciding not to worry too much about it anymore. And at that point, things seemed to change. But before that, yeah, I was really lonely. And I also quite often would end up with friends who just, I don't even know if you could call them friends. It was people who, they would be friends with me because it made them feel better about themselves, you know? Like I would have one girl who would hang out with me, and I remember years later running into her and she was just so judgmental. And then sort of groups that I would hang out with when I was kind of slightly older, but it was always, you know, I was there to be the sort of the punching bag, the one that they would pick on or, you know, be nasty to or make comments about. There was always like the clique and then me. Other than the clubs that I was part of, it's what got me into the arts. Because I was so kind of isolated at school, my mum signed me up for a choir and for musical theatre and various things like that. So I started to find some sort of other fellow oddballs outside of school. But, you know, you spend a lot of your life there when you're a teenager. I'm a naturally optimistic and happy person, but I found school awful, really found it awful. I think I connected better with teachers than I ever did with other kids. Interestingly, as I got to the end of secondary school, I sort of found some people that I connected with a bit better. And because everyone got a bit older, and a lot of people left as well, a lot of the people who would really kind of seek me out and kind of be openly horrible in the street and just, you know, say nasty things to my face and things like that, a lot of them left school. My brother seemed to really struggling though, you know, his friends cut him off. I can't even remember exactly what it was, but I just remember that as he got to the later part, we were only a year and a half apart, so we were actually a year apart at school, and he moved school because where I was isolated but actively trying to make friends, and I guess I probably developed a bit of a butterfly, you know, social butterfly way of being, because I would find like one person within each different group that I could connect with, and I would talk to them, and I would talk to people that were older than me, and I would talk to people that were younger than me. So I kind of just got comfortable being a sort of lone ranger, but I'm just very sociable, so I would still keep persevering. And eventually, you know, I did feel like I was part of my year group at least, but I didn't stay in contact with anyone that I went to school with after I left. We got to a point of being okay by 6th year. And then, you know, after I left, I was like, I have no real connections to any of these people. So, but at that point, my brother actually moved to the school that my mum was teaching at. And we didn't know at the time all of the reasons why that was the school that we were at was causing so many problems for him. That was also a kind of weird moment for me because he was very, very lonely. And I found it fascinating because in my loneliness, as I said earlier, I was always wanting to connect with him and for him and I to be friends, but he just really wanted his own identity and his own space, and he didn't want to be hanging out with his sister all the time. But I remember when he left the school feeling like it was weird. He was kind of it was always nice to have that familiar face around, even if he was walking in the other direction, you know. So in a weird way, I think the worst part of school was actually earlier. And in the later part, I was starting to explore Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So I'd started experiencing pain in my joints, particularly in my feet and my knees, and started getting going to see the doctor and getting that sort of diagnosis, which was starting to make a bit of sense of why I was tired and inattentive and not really always fully up to speed with what was going on.
In the delicate space between belonging and isolation, there lies a world of experience that shapes how we see ourselves. As we pause in Kim's story, let's take a moment to reflect on the deep imprint that childhood experiences leave on our sense of identity and worth. Find a position that feels comfortable for you. Notice how your body feels in this moment. Perhaps there's a tension you're holding from Kim's words about feeling different, or perhaps there's a recognition in ways we all search for connection. Take a full breath now, drawing air deep into your lungs. As you exhale, imagine releasing any judgment about your own journey of finding your place in the world. Perhaps you recognize parts of yourself in Kim's early stages, or in the ways she tried to reinvent herself away from home. Or maybe you're simply here listening and witnessing another's experience. Whatever brings you to this moment is welcome. Join me for 3 steady breaths. Breathe in, 2, 3, 4, and out, 2, 3, 4. Breathe in, 2, 3, 4, and out, 2, 3, 4. Breathe in, 2, 3, 4, and out, 2, 3, 4. Carry with you whatever resonates from Kim's story so far, knowing that these early chapters form just the beginning of our much deeper journey. And when you're ready, we'll return to hear how Kim's path continues to unfold.
When I left secondary school, I went to London. My mum's sister lived in North London at the time, and we were really close, and she had made a deal with my parents that if I did well at school, I could go and spend the summer in London and work and just kind of experience a different place. This was a really life-changing thing for me. I moved there with very little money, but I went down and got a temp job working in a mail room. And I remember I cut all my hair off before I went. I had really long hair and I just cut it really, really short before I went. So I felt like I was shedding some of my kind of teenage identity. I was going to this place where no one really knew me and I could kind of reinvent myself. Quite quickly after I got there, I remember I went out one night. My aunt and her partner were out of town, and it was like my first or second weekend in London, and I was 17, and I was, on my way home from work and thinking, this is ridiculous. Why am I going home? I should go and do something, I should go and meet people or whatever. But I didn't really have anywhere to start or any clue how to do that. So I think I picked up a time out, found a bar that looked like it was quite interesting. So I went and ended up just chatting to some girls that were on a night out. And then through the temp job, met another girl, and I had to lie about my age when I was doing the temp jobs because I was, as I said, only 17, and I was applying for temp jobs to do sort of silver service and to work in catering and service around London. So I had said I was 23, and then met this girl on the bus to work and had told her I was 23 to keep up the permission to work in this place. And then through her ended up meeting a bunch of her friends. You couldn't get people who were more different from me socially. They were all at Cambridge University. They all came from upper middle class sort of backgrounds. They'd all been to private school. They are still some of my closest friends, because what I learned from hanging out with them was it was okay to be smart. It was okay to be interested in the world. And it was okay to be a bit weird. Like, they're all a bit weird. And so in a way, I kind of found my tribe, and I'm glad I found them when I did, because I think if I had been much older, some of the sort of class assumption and stereotypes might have come into play. But I just had no concept of the fact that these people were what my family would consider to be posh. So it ended up being like a really positive experience in some ways. It was also a huge learning experience for me, because I got into quite a lot of trouble away from home, free from the sort of need to behave the way my parents wanted me to behave. I got into lots of different drugs. I got into lots of debt because I was trying to keep up with people who were from a background that I was not from. Again, it's something I've learned about ADHD, is this kind of kicking things down the line. You know, I'd be like, oh, I'll just take out this store card, or I'll just have this overdraft, and that'll keep me going for a while, and I'll be able to keep up the pretense that I'm part of this crowd and that I can be like them. And then also, because I had told the girl on the bus that I was 23, that also was the age that all those people thought I was for the first kind of year, that maybe not quite a year, but certainly for the first while we were friends. And I remember I'd been going out with one of them, and he was coming to Glasgow to meet my family, and I thought, I have to tell them that I've just turned 18, you know? So they all thought I was about 6 years older. But this was like a little phase in my life where I had such a poor sense of my own identity and my own self-worth that I just created just a slightly cooler version of myself, you know? I didn't think they would want to be my friend if they thought I was younger. I didn't think they would want to be my friend if they didn't think I'd been to university. So, you know, the first few months was definitely an extension of that anxiety and lack of self-esteem when I was trying to pretend to be somebody that I wasn't. And I'm really fortunate that when I did tell them, they were forgiving and understanding. I actually had to move back to Glasgow because my parents found out about the drugs that I'd been taking. So my mum came down and got me and took me back to Glasgow. I didn't even know she was coming. She just turned up at my flat. And 3 hours later, I was on a bus back to Glasgow. That was maybe a year and a half after I'd moved there. Once I came back from London, I remember just being really angry at my parents for sort of interrupting my flow, you know? And now when I look back on it, I'm very grateful to them for taking me out of the situation that I was in. I think it could have got really quite bad if I had stayed there, because I didn't have a sense of perspective. I didn't understand that I was trying to do something that was, first of all, financially not available to me. And second of all, the people that I was friends with didn't come from a background of poverty and trauma. My family are wonderful. My mum and my dad are incredible, but my dad is my stepdad, and my first father figure would have been my mum's partner who was violent. So I don't really remember that, but I do know that the first couple of years of my life were very unstable, and we moved around a lot, and there was this kind of violent thing. So I think my mum, she didn't say any of this at the time, but I suspect that she probably saw that, you know, what was okay for them was not going to be okay for me, and it was going to lead to some very dark places if I was left to it. So I was furious. I also carried a lot of shame for quite some time. I would say that I've carried shame about that period of my life until really recently. You know, like very, very recently. I went to college. and did some art stuff. I was really terrible at further education and higher education. I kind of bounced around doing sort of like art and design and portfolio preparation, and went to art school, but I never ever completed a year. After I'd been diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, I was maybe about 14 when I got diagnosed, or certainly when I started the process of getting diagnosed. And then I just ignored it because I was in London and I was having a great time with my friends and I was going out clubbing a lot and I was, working in pubs. And I just thought, this isn't a problem. I'm not thinking about this anymore. After a few years of working jobs that didn't satisfy me and that I felt, I would often struggle to turn up for every shift. I would often be late. And it wasn't until I was starting to get into my sort of early 20s, I think I was about 22, when I decided I wanted to go back to university. And I got accepted into architectural studies and European studies at Strathclyde University. And I started that course and then started seeing someone, and I fell pregnant. But I didn't find out I was pregnant until after I had broken up with the guy and decided that it was not the right thing for me to have a child at that time. And I think the process of going through that termination, having arrived at what felt like a kind of more mature place where I was ready to do something that was going to be positive for my life by doing this university degree, and then sort of falling pregnant, all that kind of shame stuff came up again. And I was like, why am I such an idiot? And the self-hatred that comes out of making mistakes, especially when you're young. And then also it has a real physical effect to have a pregnancy termination, to be pregnant and then not be pregnant, like really messes with your head. And what I didn't obviously realize was the effect that these things were going to have on my Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So within about a month or something of the termination, I realized that I was not getting better. I was just, incredibly depressed. I was incredibly anxious. I was in a lot of pain all the time, and I was having all these other symptoms that were starting to really create problems for me at that point. I then went back to the doctor, and that's when I started my journey with different types of medication that they prescribed, which was a period of my life that was really, really challenging. But at the same time, my brother, who was, again, still my sister at this point, our relationship had improved, but mainly because we were both out of our sort of family home. So we were both doing our own things. And then we ended up back in Glasgow around about the same time. And I remember shortly after I'd sort of gone to the doctor and had my termination and everything, running into my sister in the street. And she said to me, I've got schizophrenia. And I was like, what? And she said, yeah, I'll tell you about it another time, but I've got schizophrenia. And I was like, okay, what? And it was kind of a classic thing where I would run into, my sister would be out with, her weird pals, and I'd be kicking about Glasgow and we would run into each other and we'd go for a pint or whatever. But this was the first time that I'd heard of this. And then over the next couple of days, it actually transpired that my brother had been sexually abused by a teacher at our secondary school for several years. And then so that year was the year that I was having my first major flare-up from Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and also watching my sister at the time go through her first experiences of hospitalisation, and also just finding this out, and my parents finding this out. And the other kind of impact of that happening at the same time was, even though my health was falling apart and I was having my own challenges, my sister was suicidal and had been sectioned, and everything had just come to a head. This was like 10 years after it had happened. She couldn't keep it to herself anymore. And so I had to move out of the house, out of our family home. We would be back and forward. And at this point I was back. So I was homeless for about 8 months and sort of sofa surfing around other people's houses, because my brother needed to be able to stay at home so that he could get looked after by my family. So this was, and I think the other thing that really affected me was that the first time I went to visit my brother in the hospital, he was at Monklands in the psychiatric ward. And we sat outside, and I remember it so vividly. It was a really sunny day, and we were sitting on a kerb just outside the hospital, outside the visiting area. I was asking him about it. I was like, what happened, and etc. And then he just turned to me and went, "You knew though, didn't you?" And I was like, "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't know." And it was because apparently I had seen him in a car with the teacher, or a friend had seen him in the car with the teacher, and I'd asked him about it. I was like, "Why were you in the car with, such and such?" At the time, I remember just him saying, "Oh, he was just giving me a lift home." And then I never really thought anything of it again because I was myself so young. I was only a year and a half older than him. So it wasn't in our awareness at that time. We're talking about the early 90s. This wasn't part of our social awareness that these things happen, but it was also a Catholic school. So the kind of willingness of the school to deal with it when we did find out, and when we did try and raise it with them, and when we did try and get the teacher reported to the police, it basically ended up being 10 years of just trying to support this person who'd been through this terrible thing and not told anybody about it, and nobody wanting to do anything about it. So he never actually got any kind of vindication through the teacher being charged or anything like that. So that was starting the same time that my condition was really flaring up for the first time, and that I was kind of back from London, having sort of had this spectacular rescue mission from my parents because I was doing too many drugs, basically. So yeah, that would have been about 2006. And it was the beginning of a really, I think, the toughest 12 years of my life.
As we come to the end of this first part of Kim's story, we stand at the threshold of what she describes as the toughest 12 years of her life. A period where her own health challenges would become increasingly entangled with her siblings' profound struggles. Kim's early experiences highlight how childhood isolation, financial hardship, and feeling different can shape our sense of self. The relief she felt in London upon finding friends who embraced intelligence and eccentricity shows just how powerful acceptance can be when we've grown accustomed to its absence. Yet within this newfound freedom came challenges: spending beyond her means, experimentation with substances, and creation of a slightly older identity, all reflecting someone still searching for solid ground. Kim's parents' intervention, bringing her back to Glasgow, was met with anger, but is now recognised as an act of protection that likely prevented a darker outcome. These early chapters reveal patterns that would continue throughout Kim's life: the tendency to care deeply for others while struggling to establish healthy boundaries, and the physical manifestation of emotional distress through her Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. In part 2 of our conversation, we'll follow Kim through the complex intertwining of her health journey with her brother's struggles with mental illness, addiction, and gender identity, a period marked by profound caregiving challenges, systemic failures, devastating loss, and ultimately a path towards healing. If you have experienced or experiencing anything described in this episode, you will find support information in the notes to accompany this podcast. A Sonic Hug is recorded, edited, and produced by me, Helena Rafai. Until next time, deep breaths.
From the Big Light Studio.